Hello, welcome to this week's Back to the City. I'm Simon Calder, and I'm very excited to be joined by Andrew Lentz, the frontperson and songwriter for Splash.
Yes, indeed.
Splash with 2 asterisks
Yep.
and exclamation point. I love the story I read in a past interview about how the name came about.
Yes.
You picked it from a bucket.
Yeah, it was a confluence of a number of things. Was I'd been started writing a lot of the songs that would become this album from this online songwriting group where we were doing prompt writing, and so I already had songs "When the Well Runs Dry" and "Here Comes the Flood," and then I went off to this program called Sleepover Mystery School, where as part of the ritual we had to sign our names into the Book of the Dead and pick a new liminal name out of a bowl, and the name that I got was Splash. And I don't know, I never really had any kind of nickname prior to that. Like, some people called me by my last name, but it felt like it fit, and just kind of related to some things I was trying to bring into my life, and so I feel like that name kind of chose me, and so it was a personal nickname before I adopted it for the project. Although it still does technically it refers to me and not the band, like Iron and Wine or Saint Vincent.
Yeah, what I read in this past interview, you said that liminal name helped you to connect with some qualities you were trying to bring more fully into your life and to let go of some other things.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple aspects to that. On one hand, just like, it's coming. This was like immediately post lockdown, and so there was just a lot of heaviness and a lot of seriousness, and I was trying to get some more socialization and some fun in there, but then also, like, with the album title of Breaking the Dam, and one of the big themes is like sort of the release of in a lot of like esoteric traditions or in the tarot, water represents emotions, and so Breaking the Dam is really about like breaking down these walls that we use to mitigate our own expression and our creativity. And
yeah, absolutely. So all of this is extremely relatable to me. We're friends. We should establish we're doing this for a long time, and we're both mystics, which we haven't really spoken about all that much. But I think we're about to. So I also engaged in a songwriting practice, it's in the same songwriting practice rather. For me, I had to write 10 songs in 10 weeks.
Oh, wow.
And that led to the record Hum, which spawned my new band Sunshine Emblem.
Right, yeah.
And the first prompt was Well, which is a nice synchronicity.
Yeah.
And I experimented with feeling more into a persona. I was already using it right before the pandemic. Cephas, I was like doing so after my band Infinity's finished, I was doing stuff as Cephas, which was similarly a name that was given to me, Peter Cephas, by some mystics. And I feel exactly the same way, that being able to experiment with identifying with this new liminal thing.
Oh, yeah.
Is something that really helped me a lot. And like a
100%.
lot of the material on the Hum record came about through identifying with the Cephas thing. So focusing back on identifying with Splash is an example of a practice, I think. And in all of these songs on your record and in the past interviews, I experienced a recurring focus on cultivating a practice and experiencing for oneself, for want of a better phrase, the rose garden. I use the phrase the rose garden. This is the first single, and there's an excellent video that we'll talk about soon. When I said about relating to the rose garden, the practices perhaps enable one to have experience of the rose garden. What am I talking about?
Yeah. Let's see. I begin with that. So that is sort of the reason that I wanted to release Under the Rose first is that I do consider it a little bit of like a thesis statement for the project, and that's always sort of been it's been a major pursuit. I've spent a lot of time over the last years on meditation retreats and yoga practice or various mystical and spiritual traditions, and it's become a really big important part of my life. albeit one that gets maybe left behind in a lot of like social interactions, because that's the other point about these things is like, as you said, like it's experiential, So, and I'm happy to talk about and love talking about it to people that are interested or that share that perspective. But we live in a time where I think like being a person of faith like sort of gets a bad name for good reason.
I set off down a path that would make most people laugh.
Yeah.
Is a lyric from Under the Rose.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So for me, I would like when I'm talking to someone, like I would rather have someone like even like the Buddha like would often say like see for yourself. Like I would rather have someone like explore for themselves than take my word for it, because that's where all of everything that I think or that I feel came from my own experience, and not because someone handed it to me, and I wouldn't expect it to be any different
Totally.
for anyone else.
For me, that's what it means to be a mystic.
Yeah.
I characterize us both as mystics. I hope that's okay. Do you?
Yeah,
a mystic?
absolutely. Yes. Yeah.
And for me, what that means for me is it's more about experience of the divine than having a certain theology.
Yeah, 100%. Even the word faith, like a lot of people, I feel like they take to me like, oh, like I'm taking this on faith, like I'm just believing it because someone else told me or because I read it in a book.
Somewhat dogmatically.
Yeah, exactly.
It's the opposite.
For me, and it's much more about like, first, like you have the faith of like, oh, there's something here worth investigating. Like, for example, like the experiences that you might get through certain spiritual practices or meditation or even, plant medicine, like there's no substitute for the experience. So it's like the faith is like the investment of like, I'm going to put time into cultivating this practice and see, because you can't see it from the outside. You can't you can maybe read about it and say this makes sense, but like really, you have to experience it for yourself. And then, so for me, what the result of that has been is like things that I'm like very deeply convicted of that I like would not expect anyone else to sort of take my word for, because I understand how it sounds or how it looks, But
and perhaps you would not have expected yourself to cultivate that conviction.
Yeah.
But you find yourself having trusted. I like thinking of trust and faith as almost synonyms.
Yeah.
Trusting. There is a past, and outside of spirituality, this is something that we do with the songwriting challenge. If I commit to this practice, I trust that it will yield some songs.
Yeah.
What is your experience here of the songwriting practice, of responding to prompts, and trust that it will lead to songs, and your spiritual practices and trust that it will lead to experience of the divine?
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up, because through songwriting, was actually one of my first experiences of what, in the Buddhist tradition, they would call emptiness. I didn't have that name for it at the time, but sort of the impersonal nature of creativity. I remember I was writing a song at Last Nemesis that's on the first Floating Perspectives album, my other band that is more of a band. And that I remember, I wrote that in high school, and just looking back at some of the connection, how the lyrics kind of came full circle in that. I was really struck with the fact that it didn't feel like, oh, I had this idea and then I executed it. It really felt like this discovery, and so I often relate to that, is it Michelangelo, the quote where he's like, I didn't carve it, I saw the angel in the marble and I freed it from there. And that's the experience of it for me, is it's moving things around, and it's but there's this sort of felt sense, when the melody and the words and when everything is in its right place, it's there, and
you allow it to emerge.
Yeah, and for me it's more about being sensitive to that than deciding something, and it's the same thing, spiritual, with spiritual practice, that it's about, being sensitive and being open and being curious.
I relate to what you were saying about faith. A lyric in the song that I wrote in response to the prompt, is the opposite of faith is certainty. No, I don't doubt that for a minute.
Yeah.
And then there's a lyric about water, stepping in the water. Don't believe me, just step in it.
Yeah.
So we're on the same wavelength.
I'm not surprised to hear that. Yeah.
Continue using the water, the splash water imagery.
Yeah.
And of course, Under the Rose, you have analogously proof, ? Just follow me. And I think music, more so than, say, writing a text, like a mystical text. Music is something which, of course, is experiential. So many different parts different brain regions
Yeah.
are activated by music.
Yeah.
So music is a perfect medium to encourage experience.
Yeah. I mean, I think music throughout my life has really helped me to like experience and like feel and process, a lot of things that otherwise might have gotten stuck behind the dam.
Stuck behind the dam. Yeah, exactly. In Under the Rose, the question that I love that it poses questions. So you said it's kind of the thesis statement.
Yeah.
And I see this it is. And primarily it's posing questions. Such as, could it be that all we see springs from the things we do in the rose garden? That's quite
Yeah.
different from saying all we see springs from the things we do in the rose garden.
And that's so interesting. I think that connects really nicely to what you were just saying about the opposite of faith being certainty. Is that
Totally.
like actually like in my experience, like I think a lot of people have this image of like, like the like enlightened person on the mountain who's like reached perfection. It's like in my experience, like the further I've gotten down this path,
Yeah.
the more uncertainty I have. Like it's not that like, oh, now I know what's going on. It's like you become sort of more comfortable with the questions. And so for me, I sort of have this like ontologically agnostic approach where like the further I go with this stuff, the less and less interested I am in like what's actually happening. So that, when it comes to like, like what people would call like magical practices or like even like things in the meditation tradition, like compassion or like loving kindness practices, where it's like I don't know what the mechanism of action is, or even that there really is one, if I'm truly being honest. But like what I've seen is that like when I undertake these things sincerely, like that in my experience, like the internal change, or the changes of like your sort of internal relationship with something,
Yeah.
seemingly has this power to have some impact on the external situations of your life. And whether or not that's true is much less important to me than the experience of living in that way, and that it's been much better than
Totally, yeah.
living without it.
I have a similar skepticism about even trying to achieve enlightenment.
Yeah.
And certainly of the person who claims themselves to have achieved enlightenment. And I prefer being committed to becoming ever more whole through the practice of integration,
Yeah.
which never ends.
Yes. In integration, I feel like that's a huge area of interest for me too, because it's like we like I think everyone to a certain extent, but I think maybe particularly people on some kind of a spiritual path, like we find that we'll get in these like sort of cyclical things where it's like, oh, like I thought that I learned this already. It's like maybe we did intellectually, but like for me, I don't know if you have different thoughts, but for me, integration has been like I learned something, like oh, like it's actually safe to trust the way that things unfolding, and I don't have to control it. Like that would be something that I'd learn. And then integration is then going out in my life and finding all the places where I'm like, oh, except for that, I still have to control that. And then being like taking this lesson that you maybe learned up here, and then like making sure that your left shoulder also learned it, and your kidneys, like that. Not like intellectual knowledge, embodied knowledge, I think is much more important for like making something a habit.
Embodied knowledge, yeah.
I think it's very easy to know something and be identified with being someone that knows this, and then be completely oblivious to the fact that you are going out in the world and acting in ways that are wildly contrary to the values that you hold.
No, I couldn't possibly be, because I'm enlightened. Weren't you listening before when I established that fact? Speaking of shoulders, on your shoulder, there you have a tattoo.
Yes.
And it's Cloud Cult related. There's a lyric from Cloud Cult.
Yeah,
and also Cloud Cult. And the Cloud Cult image, Cloud Cult name. And what's the lyric?
It's No One Said It Would Be Easy.
No One Said It Would Be
Easy.
Easy.
The first track off of their album Feel Good Ghosts, Tea Partying Through Tornadoes, which was my introduction to them. And also, I just think a good reminder to keep close. No one said it would be easy. It frequently isn't. But just
bring that phrase in, which is on your shoulder, into conversation with what we were saying about, you referred to the shoulder because of embodied knowledge. this is kind of spiritual bypassing that can happen if the enlightened person, I'm enlightened, I'm spiritual,
Right.
I am not of this world of matter. That can obviously lead to someone not being in touch with their body and their intuition.
Yeah, I mean that's why
it's not easy to cultivate.
Yeah, that's why this work is
knowledge.
so subtle. Like there's a million pitfalls, like especially where the thinking mind is concerned. Like there's a million ways to like go astray and like think that you're doing, and it's like, oh no, like I know that this is like I know that like this is like everything is how it's supposed to be. So that's an excuse to not engage with this thing that's like maybe a little uncomfortable for me, rather than like I know that everything's okay, so it's actually safe to deeply dive into the experience of this thing, even though it makes me deeply
dive into the experience. And again, if mysticism is experience of the divine, it's all about experience and deeply diving. Splash again.
Jump in.
Deeply dive, splash.
And that is a theme. Like again, so not to bring it back to my other project, but there's a song called River Song.
Floating Perspectives.
Yeah, on the Floating Perspectives album, Swirling Ephemera, and that was about. There was about a literal river at this first residential meditation retreat that I'd gone to, and I was much younger and much more goal oriented in those days, and so I was like, all right, this is it. I'm going to
become
get enlightened. There's a phrase. Part of that, like jumping in the water, is like there's a phrase in like Buddhist like cosmology of like the progress of insight, where an early stage is called stream entry. That's the English translation. And so that retreat did end up being like a really powerful, transformative experience for me in many ways. I did not become enlightened, but by the end I had this river that I'd been visiting, and I was like, well, if not by one way, then another. And I stripped down and hopped in this river as the last thing that I did before leaving this...
into a physical,
actual
river, yeah.
That was my little joke with myself.
I love that. You've referred to the Floating Perspectives a couple of times. That band does continue to exist?
I've sort of backburnered it at the moment, because my heart was sort of much more with this project, and I wanted to like start launching that, and also being this being, for all intents and purposes, a solo project, even though I often do perform with a band or other people. I wanted to have this where instead of having to wrangle a 7-piece band and apologize if I had to play solo, where there was a project that was more just built around me, and if I brought a band, then it was bonus, you know. But there is actually a second Floating Perspectives album that is currently in the works. That will return to that at some point.
Okay, well, that's exciting.
You asking about the name,
Well, then the phrase Floating Perspectives and the title of the original record, Ephemera.
Swirling Ephemera.
Swirling Ephemera. Could you expand a little bit more about thoughts that you have about cognition and spiritual practices through the portal of this phrase, Floating Perspectives, and Swirling Ephemera?
So initially, and perhaps embarrassingly, although I will say that the shamanic path of like plant medicine has been something that's been really helpful. So that phrase initially came to me on an early experience with psilocybin mushrooms, where like I was I wasn't like very aware of my body, which I felt like I was the thoughts in my head and the things that I was seeing in front of me, I felt like a floating perspective. But ultimately, like what that name came to mean to me is like it's more about like the writing process that I used a lot in that, and still use a lot in these songs, where it's like as artists, it can be both satisfying and important, I think, to like go to these more emotionally like difficult places. But I didn't want to live there. I didn't want to like wallow in it, and I didn't want to act like that was like the answer or the end. So I always try to show some progression, like maybe not a solution, but like some movement towards like I don't know if hope is the right word, but towards resolution or catharsis or integration.
Absolutely. A favorite song of mine on the record is Remember Me.
Oh, yeah.
And you, in the Floating Perspectives on the first record, you're not playing guitar.
No, yeah.
You're playing keys. Yeah. And
keys and ukulele.
Keys and ukulele. Yeah. And then in the electronic press kit, the synopsis of Remember Me
Yes.
indicates that the first verse and melody of the song have been bouncing around in your head for years. And then you continue, I knew it was meant to be written on guitar, but I did not play at the time. Years later, it came back to me. I realized I now did play guitar. And the song pretty much finished itself in this kind of emergence of the song. We were talking about this earlier. And so I just loved the trajectory that this song takes. And we start with Mama plays the guitar for an audience of 3. Though the lyrics she mumbles are heard by only me. So there's 3 listeners and 1 person gets it. And that's you. And then next time Mama plays the guitar, it's for an audience of 2. With a transcendental air just made for me and you. And there are 2 people hear it, 2 people get it. And then by the end, Mama plays the guitar for an audience of 1, though the meaning is obscured by the tune she only hums. Hum is the name of my mysticism records.
That's right. Yeah.
I thought, no, nice synchronicity.
We're both accidentally shouting each other out.
Yeah, exactly. It's funny, and that's a kind of synchronicity.
Yeah.
My process of finding myself to be a mystic, I thought, okay, these weird coincidences, it seems unlikely.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that I don't become too dogmatic, because it's a rabbit hole. But when weird coincidences like that happen, then I'm like, oh yeah, that tracks.
Yeah.
That's what happens when I keep my practices going.
Yeah.
But the thing that I love about the song, like for me, the hum reference was like a bonus. But what I like is that it starts with 3 people listening to Mama on the guitar, and 1 gets it. Then we have 2 people listening, and they both get it. And then it's just 1 and 1, and the meaning is obscured. And that's such an interesting song structure. Could you explain what's going on there?
Yeah, that's a great question, because this is one of a couple songs that is sort of more mysterious, like even to me. And like the other one was a prompt song, but this one, it was one, that had just been bouncing around. Like, sometimes you have fragments that never get finished. Sometimes it's like work, but this, and sometimes things just come back to you and you're like, oh, I guess it's time for this. And like, this is one of those where usually at least, I do try and get sort of the conscious mind out of the way as much as possible when I'm writing, unless it's the rare occasion where I'm like, I have something I want to say. But that's generally not my approach. It's like, I usually try and let it kind of flow out, and then I let the sense come together in the edit. But this was one where it was like, I don't know, it came together like in the way that it felt right, but I don't know that I'd be able to give like a clear synopsis of what it's about in the way that I could about maybe some of the other ones.
It's the first Mama plays the guitar for an audience of 3, that bit. Is that what you had before you play guitar?
Mama plays the guitar for an audience of 3, though the lyrics she mumbles are heard by only me. Now it seems it's come to pass, the truth I thought at first would last, and that was all I had.
So then it's much later when you recall it. I like that it's called Remember Me, and then you remember the song.
Yeah.
And then it suddenly kind of comes into being with this really interesting complexity that isn't the fruit of your conscious mind, it seems. Which again, I think, so people might be seeing this and think, what are these weirdos talking about? What is it the fruit of if it's not the fruit of your conscious mind? But then I think perhaps this is where the Rose Garden comes in again. And you've spoken about the idea of the Rose Garden being primary. And you've also speak at the end of the song about the selves that we slew in the Rose Garden.
Yes.
So could you expand a bit more on kind of the stripping away of identities? I said before, it was helpful to have the liminal name.
Yeah.
Each of us found it helpful to have the liminal name, to break away from some baggage that comes with, I am Simon, you are Andrew.
And that was exactly the experience for me. It was I'm bringing in things I want, and I'm letting it, some of the baggage of being Andrew, I can just let go of that.
Yeah, exactly. And then, obviously you are still Andrew.
Yes.
But you're Andrew without a bunch of stories about what it means to be Andrew holding you back.
Yeah.
So could you say a little bit more about the selves that we slew.
Yeah.
And this idea of this rose garden play. It's not. It's not a song about like being in nature, is
No.
it? It is a song. It seems like this is the rose garden this other realm.
Yeah.
How is it primary?
So the rose garden is sort of like by standard for like the worlds of like the subtle, you know, the experience. Like you might call it like the astral or the, you know, the world of archetypes, you know, or like and oh man, how deep into esotericism do I want to get right now? In the like, as you can see from all of the different traditions that I've been referencing, I tend to be pretty syncretic in the things that I draw from. But,
Integrating.
yeah, but one of the, because that, you know, also for me, like, that's so much more, like when you see the mystical branches of like any sort of like religion or group, you know, like the further you get into like the mysticism, the more similar they sort of get.
Totally.
To me, like I find much more evidence of truth in like what do all of these like people agree on, like what seems to be common and overlapping,
Yep.
like irrespective of the symbols or the rituals of this specific tradition. That seems to be a much more compelling evidence for truth to me than like, oh, I need to pick the one guy who is exactly right about everything.
Yeah, I concur.
But in Hermetic tradition, there's a text called the Kabbalion where it talks about like how that's where like the phrase "as above, so below" comes from, which is pretty well made it into our cultural awareness. But they talk about like to look at the way the world was created. If you buy into that axiom of like the macrocosm reflecting the microcosm, that to look at how the world was created, we only need to look at how humans create. The first way is to create from external materials, to like build something. And because there's nothing outside of the all in this conception, that can't be it. The second is through reproduction, but there's nothing, again, outside of the all for it to reproduce with, so that's impossible. And the third is like mentally we construct, you know, through imagination and through images. So in this framework, the whole world is a dream of the all, or of nothingness, or of whatever you want to call it. And you know, that's interesting to me because even modern science, it like kind of plays into that, where we say like, oh, we think about like there's this empirical external world that definitely exists, but really, all we know is that like we know from microscopes like everything that seems solid is actually like swirling particles, including us and our brain and our organs of perception that perceive this world, and then like
Swirling ephemera.
yeah, and so it's interesting. It's like we make all of these things to observe the external world, but these things that we made were created by our consciousness, and they're all filtered through our consciousness. So to me, like if we're not first interested in the phenomena of consciousness and the impact that it has on the external world, like then a lot of what we discover is going to be tainted by processes and things that we aren't taking into account.
Absolutely. It's something I find interesting is that the kind of technology that you were just discussing that we can use to measure things can now be applied to measure things like heart-brain coherence.
Yeah.
Now one can measure heart-brain coherence
Right.
of the person who meditates, and there is this measurable difference on, like, to some extent, like the subtle energy.
Yeah.
There is a way
Right.
to recognize, well, when a person commits to this practice, their internal experience is what it is.
Yeah.
And that corresponds with the energy is different in a way that can be measured. So
Yeah.
what thoughts do you have about that?
Yeah, no, I think that's great. Is it's like just like I say, you know, it can't be like handed to people, you know, but there are certain things that you can hear that like will maybe make sense in a way that makes you more likely to think that a personal investigation is worthwhile.
Science approved.
Yeah, exactly. It's like you know, like the science can tell you like, oh yeah, there are benefits to meditation, you know, and that they're observable in this way. But then there's like certain things, like another one of my convictions, like we tend to think like, oh, you know, I feel this way because of all of these reasons, but I've found, you know, through experience that what it seems to be happening to me is that like emotions sort of are primary, that they come first, and then reason like runs around behind, like trying desperately to prop it up. And you know, likewise, like when we run into problems in our life, like recurring patterns, you know, that seem to be happening uniquely to us and not necessarily to other people, but there's always a really great excuse. And it's like, you know, and this is something that you can't measure a show on a machine, but it's that like when I hold a belief, what seems to happen is that the world goes out of its way to show me that I'm right, you know, and so then when I'm able to find some way of like changing that belief, whether it's through psychology or magic or whatever, you know, like
some kind of meditation practice,
something else changes.
All kinds of options.
Yeah. Oh, I just want to say, you were asking about the selves that we slew in the Rose Garden. The story that came to mind for that before I distracted myself talking about the Kabbalion was...
It's my bad influence.
Yeah. When I was at a meditation retreat a few years ago, and I'd like, you know, this was sort of at the tail end of my very like goal-oriented period of practice, and I realized like at that point like that it wasn't like that what I had been working for wasn't actually like something. It wasn't something that I was gonna get, like something I didn't have that I was gonna get. It was like all of these like sort of troublesome like habits and patterns and ways of thinking, you know, that I already had. Like it was not a path of like gaining, it was a path of subtraction, and that I would be like stripping away these things. And in that moment, for the first time, I realized like what I was working towards was actually a kind of death of the very person whose like motivations and interests and desires got me to this point. And so in that moment, like as I was like getting to a place of like sort of realizing and clarifying some things about me, I realized like, oh, actually like I really love this person and all of their flaws and their
this
interests.
Who is
that got me here, you know, and
even the stuck Andrew.
Yeah, and that was like a very emotional
baggage.
experience. And I went off, I ate lunch, and I went off and I laid down on the frozen lake, and I did a little like funeral service for myself, you know.
For the lovably stuck Andrew.
Yeah, exactly. Of realizing like, oh, like actually I owe a lot to this person, despite like, and the suffering that their decisions have caused, you know.
I like that the record kind of counterintuitively ends with love and ignorance. And what you were saying about the funeral service for that less evolved version of Andrew, say. I feel that the less evolved version of Andrew is quite present in the final track. Because then you're reflecting, well, there was a promise of love, but it was made out of ignorance.
Yeah.
You thought I was sent from above, but I was just falling Icarus. So here we're looking back at this former time, and someone perhaps idolizing oneself, and it's, in my experience, before I, by very weird synchronicity, stumbled upon a community of modern-day mystics. It's such a crazy story. But before that casually happened, in retrospect, I can tell now, my sense of self was more tied up with other people. And I was more caught up in like savior complex and the idea of not wanting to leave anyone behind, and developing the capacity to be still and to meditate and to be like, oh, what's this feeling in my shoulder? And the embodied knowledge. I like the idea of being a modern mystic. We both live in the cities. When I was stuck in England for 18 months on a farm with no one to engage with apart from my parents, that was perfect for me to cultivate my spiritual practices more, and then return to the city, back to the city.
Back to the city.
Yeah. But with the ability to, when I feel like, okay, now I'm getting embroiled in some dramas, say, and my sense of self is getting clouded by that I can return to these practices, and stillness is key. Which is recognized in one of the other songs.
Yeah, God willing is the one.
Learning to be
coming
still,
to mind.
which is going to be a single.
I think that's going to be the next single.
I'm learning
Stay
to be
tuned.
still. I'm learning to align with my God's will. That's such an interesting lyric. Could you expand a bit more on the relationship between, no one said it would be easy, learning to be still,
Yeah.
and learning to align not with God's will, but with my God's will?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked about that, because that is, I worry about that, like, people are going to hear that and think that it's like Christian rock when it's,
Right.
when I use that, I'm not talking about like some man with a beard sitting in a chair in the sky, but really, yeah, like your own internal sense of guidance. And
The God self, the inner self. Yeah.
and for me, like I think stillness is so important. It's like we do, like in this culture, we do so much to distract ourselves, whether it's like entertainment or substances, and the reason that we have to do, or even with thinking, and the reason that we have to do that is because, like, with thought, it's a tool that can be used to sort of talk yourself in one way or another, but the body is much more like sort of unwavering, like in terms of like the truth that it holds, and like when you are, still and present and clear, like there's sort of no escape from, learning from the wisdom that the body collects, that often is collected in the form of like suffering or disease, when we resist it, That I don't know if you found something similar, but I found that, like, that you have these experiences on the path that are like, like spiritual experiences, where like something strange out of the ordinary happens, or you feel something like strange out of the ordinary, and those are like really pleasant experiences. But like the more I've sort of gone through those cycles, my feeling about it is that those are helpful in that they validate the work that you're doing, and they sort of give you the faith to like continue to like dive deeper back into the integration and into like the healing and the shadow work. But for me, it's like what I actually find, like the changes that come about that actually make my life better or make my life easier, it's through going through the difficult things more than it's through having some sort of beautiful experience. I mean, it's all, it's all important, but
Same.
there can be a tendency to resist the difficult and cling to the beautiful. And now I try and remind myself, like, oh yeah, it seems bad, but like this is, I can't remember where I heard this, but the metaphor of like it's the bowstring being pulled back,
That is very much my experience too. And this is referred to in the song "Love and Ignorance" that we referenced a moment ago. I think that's the one where there's lyrics about suffering and suffering leading to growth. Is that true?
I think I know in the bridge, I had the gift that sadness would bring, and having to find myself again in that.
Yeah. So I feel like that's almost like a kind of funeral for the past Andrew too.
Oh yeah.
How so?
Yeah, I mean and that song I feel like is very much in the vein of what we were talking about in terms of the meaning of like floating perspectives too, of like it's, I don't know, it's a really important song to me because it's about like exactly how I feel about, that particular relationship, and all relationships, where it's like being able to sort of like honor the lessons of it, like value that time, and also like that moving on from it, that there was so much powerful lessons in like getting over the association of like this specific person with feeling safe or feeling loved, or and like and the things, another way that
an obstacle for us humans, isn't it? And then we build a narrative where, like, hang on, you, specific person, are supposed to be performing this role in relation to me, and you're not, and everything is therefore wrong.
Yeah, and like for me, it became like, oh, I'm just putting all of my eggs in this basket, and like kind of like my world got smaller and smaller and smaller, and like, which and this person was never asking for it. Like, this was my own fear, to try and maintain this relationship that I thought was so important, and then like in the end, like what I realized, like when it when it ended, it was like, oh, like now I have to, like you put all your eggs in that basket. It's like you have to figure out like who you are again, and who your communities are, and there was a big gift in that rediscovery following sort of the death of the version of me that had was really attached to making this relationship work at any cost. You
Yeah.
know?
And I see the connection with floating perspectives because it's all about not grasping
Yeah, and-
onto certain ideas, and certainly certain ideas about myself in relation to this particular person.
Right, and trying to hold both sort of poles of like the grief for the relationship and for the connection that was there, and also like the growth and the learning, and like there really is like there were gifts that came from like having to learn how to move on from that, you know. And
Absolutely.
that's why I like to end the album and end sets with that, because it's just that now I'm learning to live without you. Like it's a good,
Yeah.
feels like a good note to end on.
And it's obviously a very relatable song. There's going to be a lot of people who find the talk of experience of the divine and mysticism a little alienating,
Yeah.
but who can relate to needing to let go of a past romantic partner or a friend. So I like that or just certain ideas about that and all the projection that we as humans do all the time.
Yeah, that was one in live shows. A lot of people would like come up and ask me about that or comment on that one afterwards, and so that was like a big reason I decided to release that as the next single.
If Under the Rose has this clearly mystical thesis statement, and that's the opening track, of course.
Yes.
Then there are tracks like Love and Ignorance, the closing track, that are the same. They have the same thesis, but it's like very down to earth.
Yeah, I
and
mean,
grounded in relatable content.
yeah, like like you pointed out, we're both living here in the city, like not in a monastery or an ashram somewhere. So like I think that's like really important. And another form of integration is like, it's not like there's like the spiritual parts of my life and the unspiritual parts of my life. It's all part of the mix.
Totally, yeah. So when I stumbled upon this place in the Whittier neighborhood that is no longer there, but it was called the Sophia Wisdom Center. And it was a time in my life when I was suffering a lot, and I really, in retrospect, needed meditation, at least. At the very least, if we put the kind of spirituality to the side, just the ability to be still and to be more in touch with my feelings and to work through and process my feelings. Like if all of the mysticism is just like a fantasy,
Right.
Then at the very least the practice of meditation was going to be psychologically helpful.
Yeah,
it will improve my mental health.
Yeah.
So, and there was meditation classes. The Sophia Wisdom Center, which was a bunch of Christian mystics who were very influenced by the Kabbalah, which you referred to earlier. They had meditation classes. So I decided to sign up for the meditation classes after having stumbled upon this location. And then those were helping me work through my emotions so much that I decided to check out some of the services too.
Yeah.
And I became friends with the ministers, and then someone was moving out of the house that was attached to the chapel, and they asked me if I wanted to move in because we were friends.
Right.
So then for about a year before the pandemic, I would be able to wake up every morning, go through a door, and then meditate in a chapel.
Yeah.
And this was a couple of blocks away from Mortimer's, where I would do the Back to the City sessions.
Yeah.
So right in the center of the city, this hub, but this place of stillness as well.
I had a similar experience with Common Ground, which is still there over on
Yes.
in the Seward neighborhood, right by the former site of the Hexagon. But I had moved in like right around the corner from there, and just ended up showing up at a time where I really needed it. And it was like at that point it was like really helpful for me to have a place to go, you know, and like
A physical place to go.
yeah, because it is hard. Like so many people, like you hear them say like, oh, I can't meditate because like when I try, it's like it doesn't calm me down. I feel this, and I wish that I could often, I'm hearing it not in person, but I wish I could tell them like, no, you're doing great. Like, because the point isn't to make yourself be calm.
No.
The point, at least not in the insight tradition, the point is to see what's there, and then
Recognize. Slow down.
change
Yes,
happens sort of by its own power, like out of the awareness.
Yeah. So if you decide to start meditating and then think, oh no, this is wrong, I'm feeling really agitated. No, it's right, because we're slowing down, recognizing, oh,
Yeah.
right.
And for me, there's been this curiosity that's just been so key, because it is like, again, it's like we're almost like conditioned, where it's like we feel like these emotional or energetic sensations, and like the response is like, nope, get away, look away, don't touch that, it hurts.
Yeah.
But like really,
Get
like
back
for
to
me,
work.
yeah, for me, like at a certain point, it's just like, oh, what? Like why? Like it's just a feeling. It's not causing me any harm. Like why is this so difficult to be with? And I feel like that frame for me has been much more helpful in like getting some space to like go towards it, instead of
To be with.
follow that sort of automatic knee-jerk response to get away from it.
Yeah, totally. So once I found myself, suddenly once it got to the stage of, okay, now I live in a house that's connected to a spiritual center and a chapel, I decided to like check out some of the writing of the person who like set up that community, Mystics, and the main book was called Mystical Roses of Peace. And it's a really kind of down-to-earth thesis, really, about the kind of these subtle energies. And so a passage that strikes me as particularly relevant, in the same chapter there's a focus on the difficulty that we have being still in our culture. But it says, the inner realms of our beings are quite vast. Our thinking and emotions have blocked our ability to delve into these inner realms. Within those realms, all the functions of our thinking and our emotions are used to running the show. The cravings of our five senses for a myriad of comforts pull on our attention. Consequently, when we go inside ourselves seeking relationship with God without a guide, it is as if we are in a... So if we don't have practices, say, to help us, it is as if we're in a foreign country whose language we do not know and whose culture and layout are unfamiliar to us. It would be as if we were looking for a particular person for whom we have no known locational address. The likelihood of us finding that person by spending an hour or two a day wandering around this vast country, even if we do it for years and years, is quite low. It's a good book, and it seems very relatable to everything that we've been saying.
No, I had to smile when they talk about the like learning a language because excuse me, when I first started meditating, like that was one of the ways that I sort of explained it to people who didn't have sort of a background in meditation. It's like, well, you know how like if you were to like go down to Mexico, not speaking a word of Spanish, and you were just to live there for a while, like eventually you would just start picking it up. And it's sort of, that was sort of my metaphor for meditation. It's like, you just show up like to all of the messages of your body, and like eventually, like if you spend enough time just sort of immersed in that, then you start to understand what it's trying to say, And like to that, I feel like, I said a lot earlier. It's like, oh, it's you can't be handed to you. It's not like you have to experience for yourself. But also like on the other side of that, I feel like sometimes like when you hear things, like I've read some of the most powerful things that I've read or heard from others is like when it's like an affirmation of something that I was already sort of coming to see or coming to realize in myself.
Yeah.
And that's that's why Cloud Cult, we were talking about earlier, is so important to me, because like when I was in high school. And I was starting to like discover some of my things about my worldview and my like in a way that is not incredibly prevalent in most high schools. Certainly not in mine. Like that they were saying things, like I was hearing stuff from Craig and from their music that was that I really needed to hear. That was like validating what I was feeling and what I was experiencing, but that I wasn't seeing as reflected in my life and in the world and the people around me at that time. And
the music of Cloud Cult was enabling connection that nothing else was a catalyst for.
Yeah, he was describing the world as I was experiencing it, rather than the sort of like the scientific materialism that sort of come to define
Totally.
our time. And again, like, I want to be clear here that, like, you know, I think there's a lot of value in empirical science, and I think, like, I don't think it's a question of either or. I think that it's like both are very important framework. They're good lenses, and you know, what does a lens do? A lens lets you focus on something and see greater detail in that, to the exclusion of everything else.
Yeah, intentionally.
Yeah, and
yes.
and so I think, like, we do ourselves a disservice when we think of either one as being like capital T truth,
Absolutely. So fast forward to this record, and Shannon from Cloud Cult
Yes.
performs on multiple songs, including Under the Rose,
yes, yeah,
which I think is a wonderful kind of case in point. Like, you're feeling more connected with things that you know initially when you're hearing Cloud Cult, thanks to that music.
Yeah.
And now you are like in connection and collaboration, co-creating with a member of Cloud Cult. Could you say a little bit more about how that came to be and the significance of that?
yeah. So I mean, they've definitely been a guide star for a while in terms of like showing me like what music can be, and like, you know, I would love for my music to be able to be that for other people as well. And I don't know, actually, to answer this question, I'm gonna take it back even further, and just sort of like the overall like trajectory of sort of my spiritual path is like when it was just intellectual and interesting, you know, I love to talk about it all the time.
Yeah.
And then as I sort of got into like some more dedicated like practice,
Yeah.
and I tried several times over the year, but I had always abandoned. Like, but when I finally got into through Common Ground, I got into like regular like dedicated practice, and I started to feel like I was sort of watering some of these seeds that I'd been planting over the years through study and through reading. And then, you know, I started to see like, oh, all of the work that I needed to do on integration, like all of my own ways where I was being like, oh, except for that, and like acting completely at odds to my own values and morals. And like for a while, like it just became very like solitary, and like I was very like suspicious of people that were like presenting themselves outwardly as spiritual. I was like, well, you know, it's, you know, you got to do the work, you know, maybe a little judgmental. And then like after a time of that, I got to a certain point with that where I started to realize like, oh no, actually, like now what I'm experiencing is like a deep. So I was saying, like, as I, you know, I talked about it before, and like as I got less and less willing to talk about it, as I was trying to deepen these roots within me and make some real changes, like I didn't want to like subject it to other people's like derision or scrutiny as much, you know, and but then at a certain point I found like, oh no, there's actually like a real hunger here for community around this, and for spiritual connection. And that's when I joined the mystery school, where I got my name. And then following that, I was actually at a conference here at the Varsity. There was like a singer-songwriter, like Find Your Stage, like seminar, and that's where I met Matt Patrick, who ended up producing the record. But there was someone on one of the panels there that was talking about, he was like, you know, I really wanted to be like this cool like bass player guy, and he's like, but then eventually I realized like I was a gear nerd, and when I started making videos about like my gear, like just accepting who I was and putting out there who I was, like that's when I started finding my audience more than when I was trying to like pretend to be something else. And so even though, you know, this has always like been sort of what was behind my music, even back to the Floating Perspectives days, like there was like a fear about sort of being coming out, if you will, as a spiritual person or as a mystic. And so that's kind of what I meant about this being the thesis statement for Under the Rose, is like there was part of like being willing to like come forward and say like, hey, this is who I am, and like this is what's been helpful to me, and knowing that like even though inevitably like there probably will be people that won't understand or that will laugh, like that's the only way to allow the people who maybe will get something out of it to find me, you know.
Totally, yeah. And there's all kinds of reasons why not to talk about it, and you know, the fact that some people will of course laugh is one. Yeah. The fact that, you know, it is, we're doing inner work, and it could be somewhat of a distraction to like talk about it too much. Yeah. Especially if they're going to make you feel self-conscious about it. You know? And I never normally lead with I'm a mystic. Yeah. Certainly not on Back to the City, but in this instance we both are, and there's so much parallel. So I thought So I thought, to quote someone, if you don't tell people who you are, they can't hurt you, but they can't love you either.
Yes, that is a
Who
quote
said that?
from one of my mentors, Dr. Robert D. McDonald, who's was one of the foremost world experts on NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, but then sort of split off from then to develop his own technique that included more of the spiritual or the transpersonal, as he would call it.
So a connection comes about when we, and this is the central thesis of my Hum record too. There was a parallel record. I Let Love In is opening oneself up to the possibility of connection through not hiding. It's related to being with the thing that one wants to push away as well, so that one can integrate it, so that one can show up more and more fully.
And so that's sort of where I was at when I started the process of recording this album. And even when I was writing these songs, I started writing on guitar over the pandemic, and I was like, this doesn't really feel like the Floating Perspectives, And I didn't know what to do with them at first until I had a selection. But so I decided, I did this whole different process where it's like, instead of recruiting a band, getting arrangements, and then going into the studio and trying to lay it down as quickly, as cheaply as possible, I went, work with Matt, as a producer, here's what I have, let's build it up, and really try and do these songs justice and present them in the best possible light, and work with new people. And that's where Shannon came in. I had
I wonder whether the cellist from my favorite band would like to play on my record.
And so I had met Shannon, briefly after shows, but I really made the personal connection through another local musician, Eric Carranza, who plays with her in Battery Boy, and who is the one who's working on the next Floating Perspectives album with me. That,
I know Eric.
We'll get back to eventually. But he knew Shannon, and so I reached out to her, and I sent her the tracks, and she already knew. I showed her my tattoo when we met, so she knew I was a fan, and was gracious enough to come and add some string arrangements to a few of the tracks, and then played with us at the single release show, and then we'll be again at the album release show, and very, very grateful for her involvement. Everyone on the record, from Matt to her, could not have been more amazing to work with.
Absolutely. So I was at the single release show, which was at the Phoenix Theatre, which seemed like the perfect spot. We were talking about archetypes before, when I was like, what is this rose garden? And then you said some might call it related to the archetypal. And of course, the Phoenix is an archetype. I have a song called Firebirds Back from Infinities before discovering the Mystic. So I was really into that. Now I recognize archetype of the Phoenix, which again relates to the death, resurrection, rebirth cycle that we've also been talking about with the funeral for the earlier Andrew. Was that? That's just so fitting that the single release was at the Phoenix Theatre.
Yeah, no, it just worked out that way. I
think I had things do.
Yeah. But that was
when one doesn't have the conscious mind trying to make it be a really meaningful story where everything fits together, then often it ends up becoming magically more a meaningful story where everything fits together.
Very much so.
Nice case in point. As we near the end of this particular conversation, let's focus on the songs that you were releasing at the Phoenix Theatre, and you managed to pull off with Shannon and all of the other musicians, performing the song to the accompaniment of premiering this excellent music video. And my favorite moment in the music video is when there is the lyric about sitting on my throne, feeling less than alone. The characters touch hands. And then it happens again a bit later in the video, the touching of the hands, the puppets touch hands.
Yeah.
And then there's references to touching hands and the need for a guiding hand, I think, in one of the later songs. Does that ring a bell? Oh yeah, it's in When the Well Runs Dry.
Oh yeah.
My patience is slipping, I can't see no helping hand. And I think it relates to like this idea, the metaphor of looking for a person and just devoting like 1 or 2, with no idea where they are. You're not going to find that person if you just devote 1 or 2 hours a day to looking randomly for them. You know, there's the analogy with the committing to the practice and showing up to the practice that will having faith, trust in the practice that eventually will lead to some fruits. This idea of looking for a person, I think, is maybe again more than an analogy. If again, that's the lyric about finding stillness and then your God's will, like your higher self, connection with the higher self, or something, and the connection with something that is loving and has some care for you. Could you just expand a bit more on, ideally through the lens of the contact, those puppets having that contact at that moment, on the connection that comes through the commitment to the practice?
You know, I don't know that this was necessarily in my head when I was writing it, but I've found, you know, a lot over the years, like that actually a lot of my work on the spiritual path has been related to like health issues and things like that, and I found that when in the past when I have been looking for a savior, you know, like someone external to myself to just like make the problem go away, you know, then nothing works, no matter how like the great doctor with all the recommendations, you know, can't help it. But then I found that when I sort of like settled in and like when I took on the work, engaged with it more directly myself, then it's sort of counterintuitively is when like sort of through their own power, like people who could help in some way like sort of came into my life. You know?
Yeah, you're not grasping for them. You're showing up for yourself.
Yeah.
And then
when they did, it was extensions of like sort of the unfolding of the work that I had already been doing, rather than someone coming and like taking away some experience of suffering from me, you know.
Absolutely. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Another question I have is why roses? Especially once Mystical Roses of Peace was like the central text in the community of mystics that I found. And for why roses in this instance? Well, the roses for Mother Claire, who was the master teacher at the community of mystics that I encountered. The mystical roses are the kind of fruits of being on the path. These mystical roses will light your way towards inner peace and help you address and overcome all obstacles to having a powerfully real relationship with God. Why roses for you? What are the roses?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because the roses are another thing, like they're sort of a motif that just kept kind of showing up in my life, like be it through literature, like the Dark Tower series by Stephen King, which is a book series that's been really important to me. There's the Dark Tower stands in a field of roses, and there's like another rose that's a really important symbol in that book. Similarly with Philip Pullman, who wrote his Dark Materials. He's writing he's in the midst of a follow-up sequel trilogy right now. The third one is about to come out, and roses play a big role in that as well. And that also, particularly the second book, The Secret Commonwealth, has a lot of themes about like the power of the subtle. And then also, you know, when I joined it's just popped up in a number of different ways in my life, in things that like seem to have like a powerful impact on me.
Yeah, so you recognize the resonance and followed that as did Mother Claire, so it seems. And that's perhaps maybe the finding the overlap between the different traditions. Again, it just seems, I just thought that was lovely, the centrality of the rose as an image.
I'll have to check out that book.
It's it's relatable content, or whatever. A lot of what you've been saying is it could be a paraphrase of the content. Cool. Of the book. Well, I think that we are drawing to a close, almost at the end. So let's have this be the final question. Then. The phrase "on the other side" is used at least twice And I feel like we could also think of
you're
the
right. I didn't
rose.
realize that.
So I was going to ask whether that was the product of the fruition of the conscious mind, or another case of significant stuff emerging when you intentionally encourage the conscious mind to have less control.
Yeah.
So being in the rose garden, we could be on the other side in the rose garden.
Yeah.
But the two references to the other side are in Light and Shadows, Nothing Scares Me Now, I'm on the other side. And then also in
Always Greener.
Always Greener.
Yeah.
Yeah. And of course, Always Greener on the other side. But I think something beyond, not including, but not limited to, the idea that things seem better for Andrew than they are for me. He seems to be a better mystic than I am. So that idea, there's something more going on than just the grass is always greener on the other
That's
side.
interesting. I never made the connection that both those songs use on the other side. And interestingly, I didn't think of those when I was doing my list earlier. Those were both prompt songs. Light and Shadows was a prompt, and I think the prompt for Always Greener was grass.
Nice. Yes. Yeah. That's what I read.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
It must be true.
Yeah, that's interesting. Because, Light and Shadows, that's a song very much about, like, equanimity, and, like, having a little bit of, like, spaciousness from the shadow play, which, incidentally is part of the reason why we did the music video for Under the Rose that we did. I was actually sitting and watching Nat Allister and Becca, who did all of the art I was watching their show Vonnaheimer, and it had a lot of like projection and artwork, and I was like, this is kind of a nice extension of the metaphor here of a shadow play. And so that's
of another realm, which is actually primary, and the things that we experience are a result of what we do in this other realm.
Right, yeah, just Plato's cave,
Yeah.
If you were to come back and tell people, like, no, actually, like, there's a world up there where there's light and these things are being projected from, everyone would call you crazy.
Laugh at you.
Yeah, and so that's interesting, because, in that, there are those two different uses, because in Light and Shadows, like, being on the other side is like, it's good, like, I'm on the other side of having to worry about these things, and then, and Always Greener, it's that, what that phrase points to of like that envy. But I mean, I guess that's interesting. Yeah, you're really making me think here. But I guess it does point at like another big like sort of area of exploration, like on the spiritual path, is this idea of between like dualism and non-dualism. Like to take it back to what we were saying about lenses, where it's like like in a certain lens, like there's this. And then in a certain lens, there's this, and then in a third one, they're all the same thing. They're all one thing. So it is this interesting, like this idea of like the other side. I don't know, maybe it's indicative of the ways that I'm still stuck in a dualistic framework.
Well, lovably stuck.
Yes.
Me too. I'm lovably stuck as well. So throughout this episode, beneath our voices, we've been hearing the record. The songs from the record Breaking the Dam. I've tried editing me in the future, has matched up the songs with the content of it. If we're talking about a song, that's the song that we've been hearing. But this record will be released without us talking all over it.
Yes.
In October.
Yes, October 11th at the Hook and Ladder right now, and also I guess I don't know. Hopefully it'll still be going on by the time this comes out. But in the interest of that. We are launching an Indiegogo to help cover some of the rest of the costs of mixing and mastering and promoting of the album. My employment situation has changed a little bit since I undertook this endeavor. And
Mine too.
But so you can check the website or our Instagram or maybe the notes of this about that. The album release show at the Hook. And also, one of those rewards, if you do support, is you'll get early access to the album digitally. So if you're interested in listening now, you can do that. But if not, October 11th at the Hook, another band that I play with, Paper Chain,
Yeah.
is going to be on the bill with previous guest of this show, Caitlin Benson.
Yeah, absolutely.
Back from our common practice days. And then another act, TBD.
Very cool. You have a website?
Yes. So website is SplashySongs.com, because both Splash and Splash Music were taken, and also,
Splashy Songs is better anyway.
Yeah, I thought, with how sort of, so they're trying to like include more parts of myself, which is like how, sort of serious and earnest most of these songs can be, like as hopefully as evident through this conversation, is not the entirety of my personality. So let's get a little levity in.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we've promised we're done talking about mysticism.
Yeah.
Just music. There's a show.
Same
October
with
11th at the Hook and Ladder.
Yeah.
Come to the show.
You can Instagram. I post a lot of like updates too, and that's at @splashy_songs.
Cool. Okay, well, I will see you many times between now and then,
Yes.
but then also October 11th at the Hook and Ladder
Awesome, yeah.
for the much anticipated release of Breaking the Dam by Splash.
Yes, and thank you so much for having me. This was such a great conversation. I
You're very
really
welcome.
enjoyed talking to you.
To be continued.
Yes.
This has been Back to the City. I am Simon Calder, the Mystic, just for this episode. No, always, but I'll promise to keep that less prominent in other episodes of Back to the City. I just save it for when I have a fellow Mystic with me. So we'll be back to our regular programming 10 p.m. Next week for another episode of Back to the City on MCN6. Thanks for watching. See you then.